everybody. Good morning. We're here in the session about algorithmic accountability. We have here 5 great speakers, which they got a very huge challenge here to speak for only 15 minutes about their excellent papers and topics. So we're going to try to stick to the time frame. We're going to leave around 2-3 minutes for questions or for remarks if you have any. And please save them for the end of all the presentation, and then they can take questions together. So our first speaker today is going to be Natalie. Natalie is a PhD candidate at the University of Zurich. She holds a Master's of Law from the University of Zurich and an LLM from King's College London. She recently joined the Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society as a fellow, and today she will talk about the interplay between global governance and AI regulation, legal fragmentation, and democratic discourse. So Natalie, you have 15 minutes, and here you go. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me like this? No? Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. So this presentation is an outcome of 2 projects. One project was the interoperability project that I was leading at the Berkman Klein Center, where we were analyzing how to use the concept of interoperability to analyze the development of AI, the legal response, and the global governance questions. My PhD is about situated in a direct democracy of Switzerland, and I analyze how algorithmic information distribution affects democratic will-building processes in Switzerland and how the law needs to respond to it. So it's pretty clear that AI affects society as a whole, and as the concept of jurisdiction doesn't apply in the digital realm, and we need to address, we need to have an approach of global governance. So the lens that I'm using here is the interoperability concept. It's a 4-tier system where you analyze a challenge on the concept of the data layer, the technology layer, a legal layer, and then a social layer. So we're looking at how those layers interact with each other. On a technical layer, interoperability means that, for instance, if you have a plug and it's interoperable among countries, which means the innovation can build on an interoperable system. Then the data layer is like the foundation of every technical innovation, and also on the legal layer we need the data exchange, and I will later talk about how different privacy and data protection regimes and limit certain innovation. And then the legal layer is pretty clear. There's a huge fragmentation in data protection law, the underlying understanding of privacy rights in democracy across jurisdictions, and then the response to any kind of AI is rooted in a concept of a jurisdiction, and the approaches that we have at the moment of global governments are very limited in its effects. And then the social layer is how we interact with the technology and how it dribbles down on how the law responds, but also how the technology responds. So we'll look at a few examples. So one example is the facial recognition AI. So China has become a leader in facial recognition because of a very low standard of data protection laws. So the AI, they could build the AI very faster than other countries because they don't have a right to your own image. And then this means that also social norms are building in exchange with this technology in China way faster. So they were using it in public toilets to Actually, the reason why they implemented it was because people were stealing the toilet paper, but it's just an example that people are exposed to this technology way earlier, and then the law responds to it in a different way. And then from this initial AI of facial recognition, other AIs and other technology evolve, and then different societies are not exposed to it. So we have this interaction of the four layers. So here we see that the legal fragmentation across jurisdiction enabled AI development, and then there's a fragmented exposure to it and fragmentation in access. Oh, that's the wrong direction. Then another example is the Cybercrime Convention. So obviously, if a cybercrime is always a crime across jurisdiction, and it's necessary for the police to exchange data, and in order to move forward with the procedure, harmonization is necessary. So that was the purpose of the Bulgaria Convention. And the reason why, in terms of countries who signed the convention, it was not very successful, was actually because of the different understanding of data, personal data, and the applicability of privacy laws. So Saudi Arabia, for instance, couldn't sign the convention because their understanding of privacy is rooted in the law of Sharia, and their understanding of privacy is the connection between the private life and the divine, and all personal data is property of Allah. So how the Bulgaria Convention was structured was not compatible with their understanding of privacy law, so they couldn't sign it. And Saudi Arabia is actually the prime victim of cybercrime. So this is another example of how actually the legal fragmentation hinders global governance approaches, but here I want to stress that it's actually going back to social norms. And then another example is Google marry their AI innovation tools in a cloud. So they made certain AI tools, for instance, facial recognition available in a cloud for other companies, startups to learn it, to implement it. And the reason for this is a democratization of technology, was actually that other companies can compete actually with Google. And they even implemented learning, like courses, where the companies and startups can learn how to easily implement those AI techniques. And then if we see that this is actually the market sphere, running ahead of the global governance, because Google making the AI tools transparent and accessible creates the interoperability on a technical level, and from there it can affect the legal and the technical and the data layer. So looking at the privacy rights, because every AI is evolving from data. So the personal data regime is one of the most important. So we have it as a human right. Then in the US, it's only a sectorial privacy protection in different amendments. So there's no understanding of privacy as an absolute right that needs to be balanced against other fundamental rights. In the European Union, we have the GDPR that we just implemented. And this notion of privacy is very connected to democracy and our understanding of democracy and collective autonomy. And then in Germany and Switzerland, we have the concept of informational self-determination as a fundamental right. So this is an understanding that a self-determined life is only possible if I know what data about myself is known by the government or by a company or by other private people. So if we're looking at democratic theory, there's the two core values that find protection for different rights actually is individual autonomy and public autonomy. So the connection to combine them is the public sphere. And then if we look at Swiss, I'm just jumping a bit, if we look at Swiss democracy, how much time do I have? Okay. Okay. So if we look at Swiss democracy, this autonomy is protected by different rights. And it's a completely different understanding of me as a private individual. So this unhindered will-building process is protected by fundamental right, infrastructure, and also social norms. One of the main roles is the freedom of the media diversity, and then also the understanding of privacy as it has two sides. One side is very connected to autonomy and has this public value, and it's the place where the political person is formed. And for that, it's necessary to have external information as well as the scope to actually build your own political identity. And then even if we look at the legal frame in Swiss democracy and how the political rights that are direct responsibility of a citizen are formed, they see clearly two sides. It's a responsibility as a political person and then as a private consumer. And in some cantons in Switzerland, there's an obligation to vote that is enforced by criminal law. So that means it's not just, it's the voting body is considered as an organ of the government. It's not just that we have the opportunity to build a political identity, but it's an obligation. So that means informational self-determination is so key. And if we look at how the data with AI are used, it's very in conflict. It's so much in conflict with this understanding. Yes, so jumping a bit forward, this is also in line with what Habermas says. So he's one of the main scholars in democratic theories. He says that the political communication needs to be as independent from the market sphere, from the government as possible, and that a feedback loop among society needs to be possible. And this is only possible if we have a common understanding of privacy law, because this fragmentation will hinder any global governance approach. And I believe, so I'm looking at how we can translate those instruments that we have in Swiss democracy into a global governance approach. And what I conclude is that there's the main understanding of we need to look at, there's the dynamic between the innovation of technology based on already a fragmented law, and then how it is experienced in society, and this also has a meta effect on other layers, especially the legal. This needs to be integrated in research and in how we approach global governance. And then informed citizenship will be key, and this requires a healthy media system that we currently don't really have, because the value chain of the media is very much linked to market incentive and not an understanding of the media as a gatekeeping and as a public watchdog. And then the third is access to technology and equality, because it creates this social glue that is very famous in US scholarship, that the social glue is necessary for any democracy. And it's the same in Swiss democracy, because there's an obligation by the government to provide an informed citizenship. So we have another institution that serves to inform citizens about the current voting topics. So this could also be an idea to implement such an entity for a global discourse. Yeah, I think that was it. Thank you.
Join in just just for a short comment, and then we can move on. And again, just take this. If anybody has additional questions, please write them down, and in the end, we will have a little bit time for more questions. So I think that on a normative level, your proposed model is brilliant, and we should think about reducing information asymmetries and providing more access to technology and to data. But I think that from a practical point of view, there are the feasibility of this model is quite problematic, because if you want to talk about more access to technology, you're going to need access to the data. And you're going if you want to get better access to the face recognition technology of China, you will need to get their data. And under the current regime, there is no sufficient incentives for China to give us their data, because data, what we have today is data lockout. There's no incentive to share data. You mentioned the project of Google as something that is democratizing technology, providing more access to everyone to learn about the technology and to benefit from it. But still, I'm not sure to what extent we can really judge the technology, because it's Google, it's a private company. We don't know how it collected the data, what obligation it made when it collected the data. We don't know the underlying algorithm, which is probably protected as a trade secret. So even if we have access to the technology through Google, which we don't have to the technologies in China, I'm not sure how much we're better positioned, because we still have just the technology. We don't have its underlying reasoning and balancing of rights and what has been done underneath. So this is something I think we should think about when we want to adopt like a broad global agenda, is to think about how to introduce the necessary incentives to have this cooperation with the data and technology, because for now it's a competitive market as to data. So this is from my end for now, and we will move on to Shirley. So Shirley Ogolla is a researcher at the Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society in Berlin. Her research focuses on workers' participation on digital platforms by examining new forms and processes for employee participation online. She will talk, you have a presentation, by the way? Yeah, so we'll put it on. So she will talk about machine learning bias and ensuring inclusion. So Shirley, 15 minutes.
Thank you. I need another minute to pour up my slide.
Natalie gave us extra 3 minutes.
Thank you, Natalie.
So we have time. We're good. Let me know if you're getting my help. Got it?
Yep.
It's this? Perfect. Great.
Cool. So first of all, thank you very much for having me. I'm very delighted to be on a interesting panel as such. Can you all hear me well? Yeah? Cool. So I'm actually going to present a paper that I wrote because I met somebody at the ICT forum a year ago. His name is Abhishek Gupta, and he's a computer engineer at the McGill University and also works for Microsoft, and he also is the founder of the Montreal AI Ethics Institute. And we both met at the panel and realized we both have kind of the same interests, but we come from totally different disciplines, and just tried to collaborate. Our topic is on inclusive design, methods to ensure a high degree of participation in artificial intelligence systems. With the rising use of artificial intelligence within different functions in society, the issues of bias within these systems are becoming more widespread, as we all know, and notably impacting a larger number of people with a greater degree of seriousness. To mitigate and address these issues, this paper analyzes current practices and dataset compilation, to then propose some methods drawing from the field of inclusive design. In this context, I will refer to supervised machine learning in this detail when talking about AI systems in this presentation, and I will mostly focus on training data bias. I know the other ones are also focusing on other topics, so I'm very looking forward to the discussion in the end. So first of all, I will introduce you to the problem statement. Most of us probably know it because we're all working in this field, but I'm trying to use some examples that also other people use in their papers that are very prominent. As you all know, an algorithm is only as good as the data it works with. It relies on a large scale of data in order to detect patterns and make predictions. This data reflects human history and therefore reflects biases and prejudices of prior decision makers that reinforce the marginalization of minorities, and that's a big deal. The dataset compilation process today only constitutes a certain group of people, and it can be improved. The diversity of the underlying bias and data is crucial to the success of machine learning systems. The use of commercial APIs with limited labels aggravate machine learning bias. Several scholars have demonstrated that there is a lack of training data from underrepresented groups and will lead to really crucial performance problems overall and further promote socially unacceptable outcomes. In conclusion, end users may be denied access to their services if the data diverges from the implemented norm of the training dataset. When the data source is dominated by a certain norm that is not representative for the diversity of users, biased beliefs may be perpetuated and concerns of accessibility and participation raised. Back in 2015, we all know this example of the software engineer Jackie Klein, who pointed out that the image recognition of Google Images were classifying his black friends as gorillas. Google said it was appalled at the mistake, apologized, but a new report shows that even after those years, 3 years since then, the company has simply blocked its image recognition algorithms from identifying gorillas entirely. So rather than looking at the data set and trying to improve, they just took away the label of gorilla. Interesting. As these applications are rolled out to the user base, the biases will only get reinforced as people who fall under the outliers, with respect to the norm captured by the model. They get discriminated against while those within the norm further strengthen the definition of the norm. In 2017, researchers from Stanford presented a machine learning algorithm that needed nothing more than a few photos of a person's face in order to identify them as gay or straight, using a sample of more than 35,000 facial images taken from an unnamed online dating website. The researchers used people's stated faces on the website as evidence and used their profiles to see if they're actually really gay or not. Computational bias. AI is only as good as the data it works with, as we all know, which can include so many pre-existing human biases. I guess everybody knows also this example. Does anyone not hear or read this article from ProPublica? Everybody knows it? Maybe you can say it. Okay, okay, cool. So another kind of machine learning bias was found in the risk assessment in the US. There's a program called Compass that is being used from judges to forecast with criminals who are mostly likely to reoffend. When the news organization ProPublica compared Compass risk assessments of 10,000 people arrested in one country in Florida with data showing which one went on to the reoffend, it discovered that the algorithm was right and decisions that were fair, but when the decisions were unfair, people who are of color were most likely to have a higher risk to be predicted to reoffend. Another example is self-driving car examples with accessibility and people in wheelchairs. As you all know, the big data problem is that we have statistic-based research, and when the data that is not outside kind of in the norm, it's not being included in the whole model, and then people who are not included in that are being excluded from the service, which means that people who are in wheelchairs aren't being detected by the recognition cameras of self-driving cars. There's a great researcher, a professor called Jutta Treviranus. She's working at the Inclusive Design Research Center in Toronto, and that's also the concept of inclusive design that I'm trying to promote. They're working with people in wheelchairs coming to a desk with the computer engineers and building the models together and having an inclusive design approach and using the end users in the whole design approach to get a better outcome. However, there are several tools and recommendations, and also the other ones on this panel will kind of propose those from different stakeholders, from different disciplines who are going to try to give some more responsible data practices. And I personally believe that there will, in a few years, hopefully we will move on to other issues in this context. And in our paper, I propose an inclusive design method to mitigate biases. In general, we came to the conclusion to talk about inclusive design because also Abhishek, he's a computer engineer, I'm more from the social sciences, and we had kind of the impression that on many conferences, and that was a year ago, now it's a little bit different, but people were often talking about the same thing using different vocabulary. And the whole discussions were kind of in this like air, but nothing concrete came down to an earth. So we kind of tried to organize the whole debate and put in a different kind of matrix, because like researchers love to have like matrices. We kind of introduced this inclusivity matrix to identify different methods. And as I said, there are different target groups and stakeholders. So on the one hand, we always have machine learning engineers who have many different possibilities on the bias prevention side to look at AI and also the machine learning bias issue, but also there's a lot to do in the bias detection. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain this inclusivity matrix on a bias prevention side, bias detection side, from a machine learning engineer perspective, and then on a non-machine learning engineer perspective. So for machine learning engineers, there are several methods to prevent bias. Firstly, annotations for datasets must be diversified, meaning that labels such as gender, age, and race, for instance, must be extended, as well as intersectionality issues considered. Later, Elena Beretta, you're going to talk about this too, right? I'm very excited. Secondly, the data generation process as such must be improved. Machine learning practitioners and researchers need to develop practices to not only consider the most accessible data for their work, meaning not only going on Twitter and Reddit and downloading all this accessible API data, but looking for other methods and going deeper and having more time also to collect that data. Yeah, so then there's also a possibility to diversify data in various manners. For example, you can combine data from different sources on a demographic and geographical level. And overall, there should be distinct guidelines that have to be developed still to ensure an enhanced machine learning practice when it comes to the application of data sets. From a social scientist to legal experts and policymakers, also for non-machine learning practitioners and researchers, there are similarly various methods to prevent bias in this context. I mean, we can also see at this conference that there aren't only one kind of researchers, we all come from different disciplines, and I think there's a big change in that, and that's really good. And I feel that from the social sciences, when it especially comes to bias and sexism and racism, there's so much knowledge from the past decades that can be applied in this context, but we have to come together at a table and talk about it and educate each other. So for example, you can use ethnographic methods and other things to detect existing stereotypes and just, yeah, exchange knowledge and also have this concept of vernacular sharing, meaning that we all come together at a conference, we have a keynote in the beginning, and we all come to one point what AI means, so that when we are in the discussion, we are not fighting on what the term is or what it is not. And also what Nati already pointed out, that the legal interoperability is a big issue, and then I guess also when Urs is traveling from conference to conference, the social norms and the vocabularies very much vary, and that's an issue. But there aren't only methods to prevent machine learning bias, there are also many methods to detect it. And on a technical level, I think that's a very, very interesting and fundamental call, because the machine learning community really has to build appropriate mathematical and technical tools for bias mitigation to uncover bias on the levels of the data set, modeling, training, and implementation of machine learning systems. So we actually really need a paradigm shift, asking engineers to just think beyond purely supervised learning models, for example, also using semi-supervised and unsupervised approaches to detect undetected biases. For example, still we think about bias in the sense of race and age and gender and so on, but maybe there's so much more discovered in that sense, and we could even use machine learning to discover those things and detect them. Information asymmetries between machine learning engineers and also the non-machine learning engineers must really be overcome, and that's also what the others are going to probably point out, that there's a big need to demystify machine learning in the field in general, so also for the public, not only for the social scientists, especially for the media, as I believe. I'm actually coming from media studies, and the way that the whole AI topic is being debated in Germany is many shiny robots on magazines, and it's really annoying because it really is not talking about what we actually have to talk about. And yeah, if more stakeholders would have more knowledge in those things, and also like as the keynote speaker in the beginning said, would have ethical modules in computer engineering in the first semesters, but also having programming languages in the early stages of high school students, then I think we could come to a whole different conversation. Yeah, so I think personally my experience is also interdisciplinary research is amazing, it's super fun, but as research is kind of being evaluated by your publications, and there aren't many publication outlets for interdisciplinary research, it's not very attractive to do that, right? Because you want to have a job and you want to have publications and so on. And I think really also like journals and so on have to like rethink their approaches in that extent. And there should be more space and more money for interdisciplinary research. And obviously we can learn a lot from each other. So this inclusivity matrix is still in a beta mode. It's just trying to kind of cluster the conversation, and I'm really interested for the discussion and your insights. And please come to me when you want to do a desk swap in Berlin, or if you have any other questions. So normally I actually do research on the transformation of work, and I'm starting a new project on AI and knowledge work at the workplace, so I look more at workers and their perspectives and how their nature of work changes. So this is kind of just a passion paper. I actually don't really work on this. Thank you so much.
But you can see the passion, and it makes it very interesting for those who listen to you. So I have two questions. The first thing is regarding this phenomenon of the lack of data of inclusiveness. Do you think it has to do potentially, I don't know, with the type, the level and type of involvement of the people who do the data collection? Because my sense is that, and especially, I had this thought when I was listening to the keynote. And I think data collection has become almost kind of like, it's the first thing that has to be done. Somebody's got to do it, and then the interesting work really kicks in afterwards. When you do the data analysis, when you come up with the right algorithm to achieve your whatever it is that you want to do. So the people who do the data collection are potentially more junior, less experienced, even though they are very good, because this is not something I would be able to do. You know, it's obviously a difficult task, but I'm thinking in the terms of the career advancement, this is the beginning of the career, and then when you get to do the more interesting things later on. So these are younger people who are less experienced, may not have any awareness at the moment. So that's my first question. Does it have to do with this? And then what do you think about this? And my other question is about this idea of developing some guidelines, which I think is actually a fantastic idea. And I don't know if this is what you're recommending ultimately in your paper, but I think this is kind of a relatively easy in terms of feasibility, and I think it would go a long way. But now the question is, have companies companies been involved at all, or have they even, been confronted to this idea of putting together guidelines for the data collection that would apply to these junior people who are doing it and have no idea that they have to do data inclusiveness? And if the companies have been spoken to about this, what has been their reaction? Do you think they'd be coming on board? Would they actually implement such guidelines?
So yes and yes, I would say. So to the first question, I really do think that the precarity of the dirty work phase, where people do the labeling. I mean, it's an interesting job, but it's very like Akkordarbeit, right? You have to label and label and label and label and label. And I guess if there would be maybe more like a supervised labeling or something, where a more advanced colleague would help, also when you have qualitative research, you come together and you talk about codes, right? And there's a testing, a prototyping phase where you talk about if the codes are good or not, kind of to approach that maybe even in that extent. But also to the second question, yes, for example, I'm a huge fan of Timnit Gebru. She's working at Microsoft Research in the Research Center. She proposed with Joy Bulamwani. Google, okay, sorry, I always mix them up. But Joy, Joy Bulamwani, she's at MIT. Timnit Gebru is at Google, and there are also some Microsoft researchers, right? And they're all working on these issues. For example, they proposed data sheets for data sets. It's an approach where you have you're like commenting and you're explaining while you're labeling the data on what kind of ideas and norms you did that, so that people, when they go back to it, they can see it and it's more transparent. And that funding for that research comes from those companies. I personally, and probably you can tell, or you can answer that question, how that goes back into the company after they do that research. I guess there are strong ties, but I personally don't know. But the researchers that I observe and that I'm a huge fan of, they're all in those American company research centers. Yeah. Thank you.
Do we have a minute for another question?
Also relate to Natalie's presentation? Or
Yes. Yeah, sure.
I was wondering when you said, like, when you talked about the need for media, did you mean like the media as we know it, like institutionalized media, or could it be anything? Like, what could be the form of control?
So I was more outlining that in order to have a global governance discourse, so in order to have a global governance approach, it has to precede a democratic discourse that is global, that is aligned with certain values. And I thought Swiss democracy could serve as like an idea in order to how to have this discourse. And the fragmentation of information across the world about those questions that we're discussing here is obvious. So in Switzerland we have the SRG, which is responsible to create the informed citizenship that even allows this preceding discourse. And every law that we pass through Parliament has the legitimization because of those institutions, because of the discourse that we have, that is framed by institutions and social norms and norms that go back to centuries. So we don't have no institution. We have a media system that is an information landscape that has been disrupted very recently, and the underlying incentives for information is not anymore chained to the gatekeeping function and the public watchdog function, but goes back to market incentives. And I wanted to introduce the concept of Switzerland having these two roles. You have a responsibility as a political citizen to inform yourself. And this is why you have a right for this information that is necessary to build your information, because we don't have the right to vote. In some countries we have the obligation to vote, and it's enforced by law. So there needs to be the institution needs to be set. So I thought maybe we can use this idea for a global governance discourse. How we do it, it's, I don't know, we need to think about it, but this is just observing that the media system is very biased and very commercialized compared to the analog world. Because new actors have arisen, and platform and social media have market incentives that are intransparent to us. And it also goes again back to the unenforceability of privacy rights. And it goes also back to the fragmentation of privacy laws across jurisdictions, because in many, like in the US, we don't have the right to informational self-determination. Is this answering your question?
Well, it's contextualizing the problem. I was wondering what the solution would be, or like what kind of, well, you're probably not relating like exclusively to media. You see it as a frame to something bigger, but I was wondering like what would be a good instance for information. What would be something that would be up to like the 21st century way of informing and communicating?
Okay, so I'm working on another project where we try to introduce a media cryptocurrency in Switzerland. So we have a fee that we pay for the governmental information institution. That is 400 Swiss francs a year. And the idea is that we get 100 or a part of it, a fraction of it back in a media cryptocurrency. And at the same time establish a new infrastructure for journalists on a blockchain to publish. Having a certification system for the journalists, and with this media cryptocurrency they have a new revenue stream, and they have a new revenue stream to trade on the blockchain. And then they would create this transparency on the underlying incentives. So the sharing, for instance, from a paper from one journalist by a media house will be visible on the blockchain for the reader. So this is a very new project. I don't have the time to explain it now, but I'm happy to discuss after if it's necessary.
Thank you, it's very interesting. So we'll move on, and later on if we have more questions at Natalie or Shirley, we'll take them in the end. So Aviva, you have a presentation, or you're without a presentation? Oh, Aviva. Okay, so Aviva, the Groot is a PhD research at the Tilburg Institute for Law, Technology and Society. Her research aims to make data-driven technologies and their application more addressable to layman users. Today she will talk about the uncertain legal space of a right to explanation of automated decisions from the GDPR using the concept of dignity. So Aviva, floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm trying to make them more understandable, but addressable is a nice concept too. I'm probably going to overwhelm you with a lot of talk. I'm squeezing this in 15 minutes, but I'll try to be as structured as possible, and I'm going to assume a lot of knowledge already there. If I lose you or you lose me, just stop me. Thank you for explaining my project. I don't have to do that, and that will save me time. So I'm focusing on the right to, or how to operationalize rights to explanation in different legal domains where explanations are regulated. In the age of what I call AI-infused decision-making. So skipping the discussion of what AI is, I'm talking about decision-making that makes use of advanced technologies that, in the ways that they analyze data, challenge earlier established paths towards understanding of automated processes that we did have before. I'm focusing on the meaningful positioning of decision makers and decision subjects together, so I'm focusing on the relational space. And I started with a slight dip, which will be a 15-minute dip into dignity, because this is mentioned a lot in literature on the right to explanation, and it's not very clear why. I try to elaborate on that. So in the various discourses on the right to explanation, dignity is named as an independent value, as a rationale for giving explanations, or even that it should inform what explanations should entail. It's frequently named in combination with autonomy, privacy, and personhood, especially in the European sphere, as I will explain. But it is a volatile concept in meaning. It's hard to operationalize. This is also discussed. It is also discussed that it is too weak to trump, for example, IP law or trade secrets. And at the same time, it's called in as fundamental, self-evident, able to uniquely address certain issues, and of core importance to uphold for the future, where we will see more AI developments. So that conundrum connects to dignity is also very much a yell in industry, where they are embracing and developing ethical standards and talking about dignity all the time, which is then by legal and human rights scholars seen as an interesting stance to take, because they are quite regulation averse. So then what does dignity mean in human rights law, instead of just as an ethical yell? Closer look at this issue, especially at the two sides, reveals some shared, predominantly Westernly developed understanding of dignity as a universal claim, inherently human aspects. But there are differences between the US and Europe that are important or interesting to look at. The Council of Europe calls on these meanings, especially in their values-based AI frameworks that they want to develop. This is like the European added value of having AI frameworks would be our address of dignity. They elaborate a little bit more on that. So I will make this talk. I will give you 5 pieces of 3 minutes. This was one. I hope that was less than 3 minutes, because it gives me a little bit more time for the rest. I'll go to the second here. I'll talk a little bit about the role and meaning of dignity in human rights frameworks and how it is functional and dysfunctional. I'll talk after that in the second one about, or the third one actually, about the role of dignity in the human rights and data protection background. I'll take the lens of decisional privacy here that I will introduce or explain for those that already are slightly familiar with it. Then I will talk about the GDPR, where dignity lives in there, or how we can recognize it in the provisions and the guidelines. And I'll conclude finally with how I think that talking about dignity, or especially thinking about dignity, actually does have some value. So it's not a swan song for dignity. Okay, the dysfunctional, functional roles of dignity in human rights. If you look at the early European developments of dignity, legal developments of dignity, very much show the appreciation of reason as a human trait, or reason as a human goal, valuing and developing intellectual and rational and reflective capabilities. Later on, republicanism, especially French republicanism, imbued the understanding of dignity with a notion of non-domination, which is becoming quite important yet again. Still later, ideas of shared humanity came to be connected with dignity, respect for dignity in freedom, but also in captivity, respecting the dignity of your enemies. After World War II, dignity was literally afforded a very vocal role in human rights documents that were enacted from that time, and also informed several national constitutions, notably those of Germany, Israel, South Africa. And in all these documents, dignity is again called upon as an inherent value, or an inviolable human worth or worthiness, a trait, a right, an objective, a bedrock, universal value. And it's also given some explicit functions, prohibition of slavery, torture, condemnation of exploitation, degradation, no reproductive cloning, no death penalty. So it's seen to inform the need for human rights, but also informs the right to define what these are, what limits should be imposed on restrictions of other human rights, and to decide which rights are actually non-negotiable. And the big but here, I'm surprised that nobody interrupted me, because obviously these understandings are a representation of a promise rather than a practice globally. So in reality, dignity still is a volatile concept. And perceptions of dignity as deserved from the status of being human will forever beg these questions of what it is that we find deserving of the status of being human, which is not globally agreed upon. Another understanding, and this is one that actually becomes more helpful, on the role and meaning of dignity is less human-centered, it's more altruistic, it's more patient-oriented, it's inspired also, and operationalized quite well in medical and environmental ethics. So the continuous development of dignity as a guide to human behavior, in this sense, sees human beings as an open-ended species, a work in progress, running parallel actually to the human rights paradigm itself, which is also a work in progress. We are then seen as travelers in the hands of our hosts, as Floridius called it, hands of the others, but also travelers in the hands of natures. This makes dignity, and I think this is the most important point here, a mutually dependent value. It's a moral relationship. And when we accept affront to dignity as a practice of self-harm, we have a strong argument for reproach in these instances. Now, to come back to our subject, human open-endedness is also makes us informational works in progress, and you said something about that already. Thank you, because that will save me time too. So we interact with each other to exchange information, we retract, to reflect, we are dependent on others to afford us these spaces and these freedoms. And we need to understand how we are being treated to be able to do that. I'm going to skip an example and go to the third part, which is dignity, privacy and data protection in Europe. I'm going to say a little bit about the background of that. And it's a story of automation pessimism. After this, I will talk about autonomy optimism. But automation pessimism, the US is seen to hold a more positive regard to the affordances of automation, affording neutral decision-making, repairing unwelcome human interest. The Loomis case, which is the Compass case, but you already elaborated on that. It reflects its optimism. The goal was exactly to do away with judicial bias, but it's not very easy to operationalize. They found that out too. In European frameworks, again with their roots in World War II, experience has a more pessimistic stance. And there, the innovative and pervasive use of registration, automation, and the whole administration was seen to create a distance between humans. And this distance is seen to create a key factor in the reduction of people to objects and our ability to create other groups and treat them as objects. The European Data Protection Supervisor report, a recent report from them, calls dignity in that sense a basic principle of personhood in the European intellectual tradition, referring to the Kantian idea of human beings as ends and never just means in themselves. Adding to this that this entails understanding oneself as a person endowed with moral qualities, rights and responsibilities. They then say that this personhood concept is inseparable from that of personal data because of the information produced by and pertaining to each of us. And treating persons as mere temporary aggregates of their data then is the objectification that does not fully respect them in their dignity and in their humanity. Another report from the European Group on Ethics of Science and New Technologies. I'm going to give you a lengthy quote here. They say, human dignity as a foundation of human rights implies that meaningful human intervention and participation must be possible in matters that concern human beings and their environment. Therefore, in contrast to the automation of production, and this is important, it is not appropriate to manage and decide about humans in the way we manage and decide about objects or data, even if this would be technically conceivable. And I think this is actually their most important message connected to dignity. Such an autonomous management of human beings would be unwelcome, they say, as it undermines, again, the deeply entrenched European core values, especially dignity. So these values and the need to protect from informational manipulation and objectification actually are especially well developed in privacy theory, privacy legal developments. And the species of decisional privacy, I think, affords a particularly useful framework to understand the current risks of automated decision-making, as it very well addresses the connected values of privacy and autonomy. Important nuance here, understandings of human autonomy that are tied too closely to ideals and ideas of individuality do underestimate the influence of others and things, and that's not what I'm trying to do. What we're trying to do is to distinguish beneficial from harmful influence. Decisional privacy is understood to have its legal conceptual origins in the US, tied to intimate and physical sphere. Yep. The Roe versus Wade, I'm sure you're all familiar with that. There's 3 dimensions of autonomy and privacy in this paradigm that are highly relevant to automated decision making. The first dimension, known as intellectual privacy, we talked about that a little bit, you know, freedom to receive information, chew on it, not be unwanted, free from actually unwanted, obscure, deceptive or oppressive manipulation here, and free to chew on that information and understand conflicting interpretations. This is our eternal debate zone where we have what Rouvra would call the minimal experience of choice. This is especially targeted by algorithmic technologies currently, and the second dimension addresses the human experience of these choices, having a meaningful role in one's own life and that of others. Respects humans as moral agents, responsible and accountable decision makers. To lead a dignified life actually means you have to be able to form an opinion about yourself as well. Make a critical judgment. The third dimension, well, there's one other thing I should mention. When decisions are made about people with the use of information that they did not have a meaningful role in creating, you could say that this unhinges the moral agency and responsibility parts that are the first 2. Third dimension addresses awareness of the normative choices that was talked about earlier. We need to train our moral muscles. We need to train ability to make meaningful choices and reflect on them. When too much choice is made for people, obscurely on the basis of behavioral data, you become complicit in your own objectification, you could say. Autonomy optimism, I really have to be quick about this. Maybe I'll skip this part a little bit because this is mainly about how the GDPR has some very good ideas about how to deal with this, except the optimism enshrined in there is criticized by others. I'll say a little bit about that. There's a principle of transparency here that very much addresses the fact that this awareness needs to be sustained. There are substantial components to do that in the law. Subjects have a right to be informed beforehand of the who, what, why of processing, and especially when automated decision making is concerned, they need to have information about the logic involved, significance, envisaged consequences of such profiling and processing. They actually broaden it to profiling in general and also to decisions that are not completely automated. They say when supportive AI is used, actually these provisions should be valued as well. There's 2 focuses that I will name. One is the focus on profiling, which has a longer history, also from the Data Protection Directive, which also in the proposals already elaborated on the fact that it needs to protect the interests of the data subject in participating in the making of decisions which are important to him at that time. And they also importantly address how decision makers need to have this understanding as well to be able to stay responsibly in control. So this is the mutuality of dignity actually that is addressed here. The second is the focus of the GDPR on meaningful positioning, also of both sides of the decision subject and of the decision maker. There is, as I said, a lot of criticism about this autonomy optimism because from different domains it's doubted whether this is actually sustainable. The STS domain, human-machine communication, law and sociology, and case studies on the implementation of automated decision-making systems show how the integration of human and computational decision-making affects the broader sphere these decisions are made in. To conclude, do I have 3 minutes to conclude? Woo. Well, the concept of dignity, I think, has a value as a tool of development, actually. It drives elementary thought about what it is we aim to protect with human rights frameworks. So in that sense, what normative claims we do still want to make about being human. And dignity's mutuality informs us to keep a sharp eye on these power balances to deal with these issues. I'll give you some examples, but I'll cut some. The perceived knowledge, or the perceived move from knowledge building through the collection of personal data to optimization via collection and capture of personal and non-personal data, signifies a move from an interest to understand the individual person to an interest in just predicting or influencing a person's behavior. And this is then perceived as accepted to speak for the person. If this is the case, then what rules should govern the deliberative space in which to contend decisions based on such knowledge, such assumptions? Because it quite literally objectifies persons, and a practice that could be seen to go against the grain of dignity, as we currently protect it and understand it in the roots of data protection law. The value of creating awareness as well, facilitating the understanding of automated decision-making, lies again not in dreams of escaping all influence, but in the capability to resist domination and sustain a community of moral agents able to protect their shared values. But the most important point, I think, that is coming up a lot is the conflation of humans and machines, with a possibly vulnerable relative reasoning there that I do want to explain. The study of human decision-making, explaining and understanding, is done a lot by designers of explanation models and also by, obviously, all the parties that are interested in predicting our behavior. And in all these practices, the comparisons of humans and machines and their thinking afford this line of reasoning. It may eat away at the understanding of humans as autonomous reasoners and decision makers in a special way. Because in replies on fears about black box decision making, especially from the legal and social sides, examples of bad human reasoning are then offered to our discredit. And the human unknowability is offered as an obstacle to understanding of each other's decisions, but also to our self-understanding. And as a famous psychologist recently said, our conscious capabilities go through an impopularity cycle yet again. But if we accept that humans are not machines, and if we also accept respect for human dignity as we have currently incorporated it in our human rights laws, then we should also understand that the human practice of contesting each other's flawed decision-making rests on other methods. Even though AI can help, as Eubanks has said, the presumption that human decision-making is opaque and inaccessible is an admission that we have actually abandoned a social commitment to try and understand each other. And psychology, neurology, and philosophy contribute very valuable insights for understanding free will, when we can hold people responsible, accountable, when we need to sustain them to live autonomous lives. And the outcomes of these discussions are very important. But the line between protecting persons from domination and discarding them as will-less may become thinner than we can handle responsibly.
So one last sentence.
Yeah, I have one last sentence to conclude. Because this will actually inform my further research and where I'm interested in your questions. A recent study by Binz et al. On the perceptions of justice in different types of explanations of automated decision-making builds on studies of perceptions of justice in human decision-making. And there's 4 dimensions of justice that are looked at here: procedural, distributive, interactional, and informational. And the interactional justice relates to the extent to which the individual feels she is treated with dignity and respect by the decision maker. And I think that's actually the space that we should be interested in. Thank you.
So one short question before we move on. Okay, so one small thing, maybe 1 minute to answer, or we can leave it to the end if you want to think and we can talk about it later.
Yep.
So if I understood your idea correctly, so you propose to look at the GDPRs. You look at the GDPR, especially on the right to explanation, and find the concept of dignity in there. But what strikes me as problematic is that, at least specifically with the right to explanation, there are 2 things that even contradict dignity, like when it says that the right to explanation is only biases. So how can this language or this wording can be coexist with dignity, and also giving the right for human intervention, making the right to explanation only available when you have no human intervention. But even if there is a human in the loop, and even if the role of human is more than negligible, I would still want to get an explanation. So these two angles of the right to explanation kind of contradict dignity in my view.
Exactly. Yeah, that's no. I agree with you there, but this is also where I think the law, as it still needs to be explained, can be elaborated in a toward the right direction. But actually, if you look at the guidelines on these, especially on these issues, they already broaden the sphere. I skipped that part, but I have a lot of quotes for you where they the similarly significant effects are broadened, and where also they say that this type of explanation should be afforded in any case of profiling and in any case of automated decision making, even if it's not purely automated. So I think everybody agrees with you there. I think the biggest problem with human intervention is that it's currently at least slightly fictional as to what we expect humans to understand of what the hell they're doing using these systems if they have not been the one that built it, and even the ones that built it, because some inexplicability is fundamental to the workings of these systems. And if you look at the network sphere in which these systems are designed and used, a snapshot will not give you much, and I think actually that's one of the most interesting conflicts right now, and I'm organizing a panel on that in Tilburg in May. Is okay, we have a right to explanation, and we need. I skipped that part as well. It was at the end. We need to afford explanations, because if you look at the global sphere in which this is happening, we don't have the instruments, assessment instruments or auditing instruments that we do have for other industries that we developed, and we don't have an intuition yet of when to trust these systems. So in that sphere, I think dignity would inform us that it's not fair to ask anybody to rely on higher order governance, and you need an explanation, but then what are you going to explain on an individual level? Yeah.
Thank you. This was great and interesting, and thank you very much. We'll move on to our next speaker. Kuba Piwowar is a sociologist, data analyst at Google in Warsaw. He is a PhD candidate at the University of Social Sciences and Humanities, where he studies algorithmic biases, fairness, and ethics of AI. Today, Kuba will talk about the sources and ethical implications of bias in AI. Kuba?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. Since a lot of effort and money goes to computer vision, and when it comes to development of AI, I will start with a photograph. And if we had time, I'll probably go with a round of questions to you about what you think about this photograph, what sort of questions I could ask to get information from you. But since we don't have time, I have this cheat sheet. We could ask, what's on it? Is it a thing? Is it a person? Is it an animal? Is it a woman? What categories do we choose to describe the picture, and why do we choose these categories over other? Would you say that this person is bisexual? How do we know? Thanks. Would that individual be capable of stealing our money? Would you trust me? Because that's obviously me on the picture. What characteristics does the individual have that are culturally, socially, and politically translucent? And the last, but definitely not the least question would be, why do we want to know that? And this is something I will go through. But before I move on, I wanted to show you a open source device, application that has been mentioned here. It's Google's cloud platform. What you do is you can actually take a photograph, put it over there, and it tells you what sort of emotion that you're actually presenting. So it says that it's joyful. I think that we can all agree that I'm joyful here. So it's quite good at detecting emotions. But it also does labeling. So we can see facial hair here, beard, glasses, mustache. Forehead, I think it's a nice way for saying I'm bald. Yeah, but actually, it gets funnier because this is a system that has already been trained, so it looks at the thing that you're trying to put there, and it tries to guess, tries to estimate. It's a statistical thing. What sort of things can we tell about it? So I'll give you this example. This is a drag queen, and just to be fair, I really had to look it up, so it's not very obvious that you get these labels with drag queens. But I found it once, and it happened to me a couple of times after that. You can see here that 71% chance it's a girl. So we can see that these systems are not necessarily good at guessing gender performances. If you look at that, this is also a drag queen, but it's also being labeled as a clown, which might be amusing, might not necessarily be amusing, depends on what sort of application do we think this sort of facial recognition applications can have in the future, and currently have as well. So I will skip the definition part, but what I wanted to emphasize here is that I will be treating algorithms and AI sort of the same. I mean, every AI is an algorithm. Not every algorithm is AI, of course, but every AI is algorithm. But when you look at the whole system of algorithmic decision making, there are three different parts of it, which is the data set or input data being used by the algorithm, the algorithmic design or the abstract mathematical structure, to be academic, which is the algorithm itself, but is also the outcome or the incorporation of the algorithm into the social, cultural, political, legal systems, etc. And it all happens within a cultural and analytical domain. So it doesn't come from like an empty area, empty space, and it operates within a specific cultural background as well. So just because there is a difference between algorithms and AI, and I think that we can agree on that AI has more autonomy in decision making when it comes to using the data, and there is more human agency on the algorithmic part. On the other hand, on the other side of this equation, when it comes to the outcomes, I don't care if the decision I am influenced by is being made by an automated system or like a simple, very simple algorithm. Social, political, legal consequences are the same, regardless of the fact if we're looking at algorithms or AI. So I will be talking about sources of bias, like using this framework, like this data set, algorithms and AI, and the outcome. And then I will move on to the possible ethical consequences. But before I move on to short description of research I was looking at, I wanted to ask you to keep in mind three simple questions. So first of all, I wanted to ask you, when you hear about the research, so that you consider where does the bias come from and where we are not looking, because I think that the most important, maybe not the most important, but the really interesting part comes from the gaps that we are not seeing. Second question would be, what ethical concerns does the study raise? And last but not least, what can be done to mitigate negative consequences of these biases, as well as the research itself, which I would like to point out here. Okay, so let's start with the first one, the example of the dataset bias. So this is she's already been mentioned here. This is Joy Bolamvini. Joy Bolamvini wears a white mask because she's been working on facial recognition applications, and her face was not recognized because she's black. So she had to wear a white mask just to be recognized by the application. And together with Timnit Gebru, they worked on a project called Gender Shades. So they used faces of black and white politicians from several countries, and they measured three publicly available commercial applications to recognize faces. And it turns out that when it comes to recognizing white male faces, it's really accurate. When it comes to recognizing black faces, it's not that accurate, but it's the least accurate when it comes to recognizing women, black women faces. What I like about this study is that it shows directly about the source of the problem, and actually Microsoft and IBM has already corrected their facial recognition apps, but not necessarily through data sets, but through skewing the algorithms. So this is also a nice way of like finding a workaround around it, but we also need to be like aware of the fact that since the bias comes from the data set, we also need to work on the data set as well. Second example is about algorithms and AI and about the research that has already been mentioned here as well. It's the Koshinsky and Wang, the Stanford research about sexual orientation. So it says that given a single facial image, a classifier could correctly distinguish between gay and heterosexual men in 81% of cases and in 71% of cases for women. Human judges achieved much lower accuracy, 61% for men and 54% for women. Does this study raise any red flags with you? Does this study raise any red flags? Do you consider this study important? Do you find this study maybe disturbing, maybe not necessarily disturbing? So for me, I would say that, first of all, why would anybody assume that gender is binary? Why would anybody assume that sexuality is binary? There's also bisexuality that it didn't take into consideration. One of the explanation of the researchers that they gave is that they wanted to warn people that this technology already exists and it can be used against them, but it's also handing a ready product to governments that penalize homosexuality that they can actually use it. Provided the fact that it's not 100% accurate, I don't know, a concerned mother can use her child's picture to find out if he or she is gay or lesbian or bisexual, and the application might give a wrong answer, and based on that, many different things could happen. Third example, bias coming from the outcome of the algorithmic or automated design, automated system. Probably all of you know the Moral Machine project run by MIT. Yeah, everybody knows that. So it's a huge project, but it also raises some red flags for me. So first question I have about this research, because just a quick round of explanation. This research preys on the classic trolley problem, and they ask people to decide or not to decide to kill somebody. So first question about this project is, why would anybody have to decide this sort of moral decision in a very artificial environment? This is not actual moral decision making when you're sitting in front of a computer with your coffee at the desk. This is not very real. I mean, I think that's in Zurich. There's been a research recently that did the same thing but with VR headsets, so it might a little bit mimic this sort of situation. But another red flag that I have with this research is that, and somebody, I mean, there's a great paper around it that. At least in the German law and mostly in most countries, all people are equal, meaning that regardless of where you're from, who you are, according to the United Nations Declaration, we are all equal. Meaning that if you are a woman or if you are a man, this doesn't make you different from the legal perspective. So if you're making other people decide who would you rather kill, you're making an assumption that people are not equally. Are not equal. So this is another red flag that I have with this research. So I was talking about sources of bias, with the data set, which is also, of course, the training data bias that can come from many different sources. I will not be going through them. But the general question here is, how good is your data? Are you sure that you are using proper data? Are you sure that you have tested them for biases? Within the algorithms and AI biases, the main question is, what is your responsibility as a researcher when using an algorithm? Are you aware of social, political, cultural consequences of the research that you're doing? And are you actually so going to the another one, the outcome bias is around interpretation of the work that you're doing and possible consequences of not taking it into account many different variations of the work that you've been working on. Of course, the outcome and the algorithmic bias can influence the data set, so there is an infinite loop of bias within the whole system. From the ethical concerns and implications perspective, we can see that at every single point of the algorithmic system, there are different concerns that are being raised from the ethical point of view. So we can see that the data can be incomplete or can be skewed, and what sort of information can we draw from that? What sort of algorithms? How do algorithms discriminate against groups of people? How do we know that if we're discriminating? How can we be sure that it's happening? And of course, last but not least, who is responsible if something goes wrong? I will skip that because I don't have much time. But so this is the same, actually the same table, but it has the potential mitigation propositions. So I was talking about 3 different researchers, Bolamvini and Gebru, Wang Kashinsky and Awad, which is the Moral Machine project. And I was looking at different sources of bias within these projects. So Bolamvini and Gebru pointed out biased data sets. Wang and Kashinsky had biased assumptions about human sexuality and gender. So the bias can come not necessarily from the algorithmic system, but also from the researchers working on the algorithms. Awad made a decision that humans are not necessarily equal from the legal perspective, and also the moral decision has been made in very artificial and unrealistic conditions. So my idea of potential mitigations of such biases can be either testing datasets for bias, or constructing and working in interdisciplinary research teams when it comes to mitigating the negative consequences of bias within the algorithms, but also solving for fairness, which I will explore in a second. This is an actual footage of a poster that I really like. This is the University of Utah. It says, "Science can tell you how to clone a Tyrannosaurus Rex. Humanities can tell you why this might be a bad idea." You can actually buy this poster for $20. I like this campaign because it asks very important questions. So when you put humanities in the loop within the algorithmic systems and without the AI systems, you get to meet weird people asking you weird questions. So for instance, have you tested for bias? Yes, I have. But really, have you tested for bias? How sure are you? What sort of biases have you tested for? Second question is your dataset diversified? And do you know that diversified not necessarily mean that it's inclusive? How interdisciplinary is your research? Is technology a solution for what your concern is? Because we tend to think that technology can solve any single problem that we have. It's not necessarily true from my perspective. Also, have you included people in the solution you're working on? Have you tested your solution, your technology, like in the real life? To wrap up, I'm going to show you a picture of, this is a Warsaw street, very close to the place where I live. It's called Warsaw Tetris. This is an actual picture of something that happened 2 months ago. So the traffic lights went off, and this happened. So when technology, I know that traffic lights are not necessarily AI, although there's sort of automation within these systems, especially in smart cities. But this is, like from my perspective, this picture shows what happens when people who are accustomed to using technology in specific situations get used to it so much that they forget about it. And when it fails, they actually also fail to work properly. Because this wouldn't happen in a crossroads without any signals, without any traffic lights. People will be more careful. So we have to be careful as well as researchers that we're developing any technology, any research, that people will get accustomed to it, and we have to remind them that, hey, this is a technology, this is something that you're working with, and this is like strictly intertwined with the social fabric. I'm going to leave you with the quote from Pedro Domingos. He's a computer scientist. He also wrote a very nice book called Master Algorithm. He said that people worry that computers will get too smart and take over the world. But the real problem is that they're too stupid, and they've already taken over the world. Thank you so much. Yeah.
And then second, with relation to bias in general, and also because within my own PhD research, I focus on equality and the impact of machine learning and artificial intelligence on equality. In how far we can take into account not only the bias that exists
try to mitigate bias somewhat beforehand,
Mm-hmm.
if we know what bias looks like now. But
So this is something
when we
that-
talk about loan applications, etc., once you deploy these techniques, you start to distribute well, and then you might distribute well being fair or inclusive towards gender or ethnicity, but you might create unfairness on a whole other level, and how we can kind of deal with that, because that's also a problem that I'm facing, that I'm interested in the ideas
Yeah.
of everyone who is currently working on inclusion and bias.
Yeah, so to quickly touch on these, first question from me is social and academic, and second question from me is political. From the social and academic perspective, people will be working on algorithms, and researchers will be making false assumptions. Researchers will have to work because I like this idea of that in computer science progress happens as in people who climb mountains. Hillary said that he was asked a question, why do you climb mountains? Why do you want to climb Mount Everest? And he said that because it's there. So people will be researching, people will be making false assumptions, and I wouldn't call that pseudoscience, I would call that a red flag within science. I would actually be reflective of what sort of science are we producing and what sort of assumptions are we making, and after that correct the research that we've already done. I like this research in a sense that it shows how important role scientists have currently to show what can go wrong when algorithms and AI are being used by, I would say, bad people, bad organizations, etc. From the political standpoint, this is a very, very important question, and I don't have an answer for that. I don't know how to distribute fairness. I think this is a discussion that we need to have all the time, and we have to iterate every single day, every single week, every single month, every single year, and we will be discriminating against some groups, even if we try hard not to do that. So we have to accept, we have to compromise. So for me, this is a question not about inviting everybody to the table. This is a question about this is actually a question about inviting everybody to the table so that everybody gets an equal voice when designing the systems like that.
So Elena is our fifth speaker today. She's a PhD student at the Nexus Center for Internet and Society at Politecnico. This is how it is. Politecnico Torino. She received her MSc in Cooperation, Development, and Innovation in Global Economy from the University of Turin. She's interested in data and algorithms ethics. Today she will talk about ethical and socially aware data labeling. So you have 2 minutes.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Okay.
The view, the view present review. The present review.
There's a button here.
Yeah, if I can. Okay, it doesn't matter. Okay, it doesn't matter. Thanks. Okay. Okay, thanks Maayan, and thanks to Shirley and Kuba for their presentation, because now for me it's easier. My name is Elena Beretta, and today I present you a conceptual and operational framework. And if we refer to the Shirley presentation, our work belongs to the bias prevention, or if we refer to the Kuba ones, to the input part of the data analysis. So, just before starting, how many of us are familiar with statistics? Okay, thank you. No. I don't want to annoy you with boring mathematical concepts. So, briefly, the outline of my presentation, I will talk about context of the research, motivation and purposes of the project, results, and possible future work. So, why we should study data ethics? We know the availability of large-scale data, often regarding human behaviors, offer an unprecedented opportunity to observe our daily lives, and is profoundly changing the world in which we live. So the automated flow and the analysis of this type of data offers an unprecedented opportunity to both public and private sectors to observe human behavior, and for a large variety of purposes. For example, to provide insight to policymakers, sorry for the delay, to optimize its business value chains, and to, for example, provide insight, to personalize services, and to automate decision making. The problem is that the way data are collected, tested, and analyzed poses a number of risks and questions related to the context of the use. Many researchers, in fact, identified a number of ethical and legal issues where the application of software automated technique in decision-making processes had led to unintended negative consequences, especially adverse outcome for disadvantaged group. Okay, this is the problem. Sorry, this is the same example of Shirley, so I don't want to repeat. But from a statistical point of view, the report alleged that Compass assigned black defendants higher risk overall and inaccurately predicted their future criminal behavior. From a statistical point of view, the prediction are twice as many false positive compared with white defendants, and yet only half as many false negatives. So I go. Why the slide are figured as? Okay, okay, doesn't matter. Okay, so the problem is that some characteristics of decision-making software and of the collected data involve ethical issues and can lead to discriminatory decisions. But the problem is that how we can consider a decision of an automated software. So considering a decision or an output as discriminatory means assessing whether it's fair or not. And this choice, this question, leads us to the standard problem. The field of study of data ethics is still in its beginning, so there are still no shared ethical standards that can guide research in a univocal way. And it is also partially due to the fact that there are various ethical approaches. So, our framework, ethical and social aware data labels, comes from this problem, the standard problem, and even if in a preliminary way, aims to contribute to overcome the problem of discriminatory effect in data-driven models. The idea of data labels comes from Berkman Klein Center and Media Lab, from nutritional boxes on nutritional labels on food boxes. So I'm Italian, sorry, this is a sample label for macaroni and cheese. So nutritional labels indicate calories, protein, and so on, content for a certain amount of food. And similarly, labels referring to data should indicate how the dataset is composed and what it contains. So the EASAL is a way to inform data users about the risk of discriminatory output of software using that data. Is a way to avoid the risk and to ensure that all population groups are equally treated and represented, and is a conceptual and operational framework for input data based on 3 building blocks: disproportionate dataset, correlations and collinearity, and data quality. Why we choose these blocks? Disproportionate dataset. We know in statistics that disproportionate dataset generating problems of disproportionate dataset results and generate a problem of imbalance when the dataset used has not been generated using the classical sample method, and of representativeness and probably leading to an underestimation or an overestimation of the groups. So, for example, at first glance, we could deduce that men achieve higher levels of education than women. And we can see that, for example, the 80% of male reached a PhD, and only the 20% of male reach a PhD. But this consideration is not necessarily wrong, but if we consider the total number of women sampled, we notice that they are much lower in number than men. And therefore, the problem of representativeness may lead to the problem of underestimation or overestimation of the sample. Perhaps, in reality, women achieve higher levels of education on average, but with this data, wrongly sampled, we will never know. We choose the block correlation and collinearity because in statistics, 2 variables are called collinear when one is the linear transformation of the other, and therefore there is a high correlation. This means that one variable totally explains another one. Why we should contain the negative effect of collinearity? Collinearity damages the estimates of the of parameters and their precisions. And the analysis of multicollinearity is necessary in those areas, especially such social sciences, more sensitive to the risk of discrimination. So to prevent these effects, some researchers adopt, I think, a naive approach that precludes the use of sensitive attributes such as gender, race, religion, and so on, but maybe not effective in case of multicollinearity. The use of geographic attributes, for example, is shown to be unsuitable when the use of protected data is to be foreclosed, because it easily leads to tracing protected attributes such race. Hard to point out that the condition of non-collinearity requires that the predictor and the protected attribute are independent conditional from the variable to be predicted. So, 2 approaches. A brief example. If you want to predict credit reliability, and suppose loan is a dichotomical variable to be predicted, so the output can be 1 for yes, individual can receive a loan, or 0 for no. And race is the protected attribute. If we use the first method, we don't use the protected attribute race to predict credit reliability. And with the second method, law and race have to be independent each other. The third block refers to data quality. In computer science, garbage in and garbage out is a popular sentence to identify where flawed or nonsense input data produce nonsense output. This principle implies that the quality of the software is affected by the quality of the underlying data. I'm so sorry for the slide, I don't know why. So, we refer to the ISO standard that in 15 dimensions of data quality are operationalized in 63 metrics, and we selected inherent quality measure because they are more effective for our purposes, because they are not affected by the context of use. Inherent quality dimensions are accuracy, completeness, consistency, credibility, and currentness. Okay, this is we don't have a design for data right now, but we provide an example of how it should look like. This is a radar chart, and a radar chart is a graphical method of displaying multivariate data in the form of a two-dimensional chart of 3 or more quantitative variables. Each tip of the pentagon represents one of the 5 dimensions just mentioned. So we tested EASAL on a credit card default dataset. Okay, I don't read because I don't have time, but it contains credit information and demographic factors and so on. The aim was to produce some plot and graph that could easily provide a visualization of how the dataset is figured. So these are graphs for the descriptive, the disproportionate block is an overview of how they should look like. Both graphs show the distribution of some protected attribute. The first one is gender, and the second one is the histogram of the variable age. Both of them refer to the credit card default dataset. The connection diagram is refer to the second building block of correlation. I don't want to stress so much the this part because not all of us are familiar with statistical concept, but this graph allow to better understand and correlation among variables. So for give you a general overview, more brightest are the square, more dependents and more correlated are variables. So you can see that this is a bad situation. Okay, for what concerns the result, and for what concerns disproportionate dataset, so the first block, the 60% of individuals in the dataset are women, the 46% have attended university, and so on. And we identified a few risks and a potential risk of discrimination for what concern the age. Why? Because the problem is that in the dataset there are a lack of information about the real proportion in the whole population and at the time of dataset creation. So this aspect is very important when we manage a dataset, especially if you are not collected the dataset. Correlation and collinearity, the group most responsible for the dependency, so it means that the educational variable and the male group are the most correlated variable with the variable default payment, yes. So this block underlined the potential risk of overestimation. And for what concerns the data quality block, the test provides the extreme positive value of the index, so therefore it is not necessary to report the values obtained. Future work. Okay, we would like to specify different types of statistical variables, so design different graphs for different type of variables, so qualitative, for example, and quantitative, and improve graphical design, and we try to make this process automatic. We also invite the community to contribute to this work because it is initial, and as I said before, fair machine learning and data ethics is a field of study that is still in its beginning. So thank you for the attention, and I finish.
So our schedule is very, very tight, and we have to move on with the program. But one short question, if somebody wants to ask or comment. We have time for that. If not, we can continue in the break. Okay. So thank you, all of you. It was a great session, and we can continue during the break. Thank you. We want to take a group picture.
Can I have one of Shirley?
So they want one together, and then okay.
Can you take it?
Yeah, you should stand over there. Yeah. Kuba, group picture.
Don't forget to tag us on Instagram, Facebook.